I'd like to spend a little time talking about my friend and mentor and colleague, Seymour Papert. And if I'm successful in this presentation, I hopefully will inspire you to learn more about his powerful ideas. The talk this afternoon is called Seymour Papert, Inventor of Everything. And if that seems immodest, I put an asterisk denoting a footnote which should indicate inventor of everything good in education. Papert predicted just about all of the issues that we're dealing with in contemporary schooling, and he shaped every bit of my life and work as a professional educator. He predicted children and personal computing, robotics in children, learning and computer games, the maker movement, the backlash against modernity and the things that are in the best interest of kids, the rise of instructionism and atrocious ideas like the Common Core, and even the sad state of educational computing today, despite his enthusiasm for the use of computers in education. Papert authored 3 seminal books, Mindstorms, Children, Computers, and Powerful Ideas in 1980, The Children's Machine, Rethinking School in the Age of the Computer in 1993, The Connected Family, Bridging the Digital Generation Gap in 1996. Each of these books shares common ideas about empowering learners through computers, using computers as intellectual laboratories and vehicles for self-expression, but they targeted different audiences, respectively academics, teachers, and then parents. Papert was also one of the pioneers in artificial intelligence. He helped Jean Piaget understand how children learn mathematics, and he was one of the founders of the MIT Media Lab. I think Seymour's singular genius is that he, 1, developed a theory of learning called constructionism, 2, that he described through vivid examples and learning stories what constructionism would look like in practice, and 3, he always managed to predict how school would reject those very same innovations, regardless of their quality or validity. He was known for some enduring metaphors like Mathland, which we'll explore in some greater detail in a moment. The notion of a pencil lab, that when people ask whether computers work in schools, he would often respond by asking, does paint make good art or wood make good houses? And how come nobody calls for a study of what would happen if we put 1 computer in a classroom or 10 in a lab that kids could visit every 2 weeks? He talked about the computer as part of a continuum of constructive material like mud pie, or something with which we can make other ideas and artifacts. He introduced the metaphor of the stagecoach being strapped to a jet engine. If you put a jet engine on a stagecoach, it would cause the stagecoach to bust apart and just manage to piss off the horses. It wouldn't make travel any more convenient or speedy. He also introduced the metaphor of what would happen if a modern surgeon could go back in time 100 or 150 years. If they visited a hospital or a surgical suite in a hospital, they wouldn't recognize anything about the practice. But if a teacher had a similar time machine and went back 100 years or 200 years or 500 years, they would know exactly what to do. And one of the metaphors that Papert began talking about predicted some of what we deal with now in the information age. In 1992, he introduced the idea of the knowledge machine, some box in every home that would allow a pre-reader to ask, how do giraffes sleep? And someone in Tanzania could go outside and look and give them the answer. We now are starting to live every day with versions of the knowledge machine. Seymour was never happier than when he was in the company of children. And his upbringing in South Africa in the early days of apartheid, where he worked with Mandela and others and was a dissident who actually had to flee the country without a passport in order to preserve his life and livelihood, stayed with him in his work with urban populations of children throughout his life. And in fact, in my doctoral research, where we collaborated on the creation of an alternative, high-tech, project-based constructionist learning environment inside a prison for teenagers. And unlike many ivory tower academics, I got to see Dr. Papert on a daily basis interact with children that society had no interest in. One of his great gifts, despite having 2 PhDs in mathematics, was he possessed a remarkable empathy for recognizing that not everyone learned the same way as he did. And we needed to create tools and practices and methodologies and a vision for education that would allow for greater epistemological pluralism, that would value difference, that would allow the amplification of the human spirit regardless of where we found it. Papert was the inventor of a learning theory he called constructionism, which was a play on the Piagetian idea that learning happens as a consequence of experience, that it's based on mental structures built within inside your head. And Papert suggests that constructionism tells us that the best way to ensure that that construction inside our head takes place is through the active construction of some artifact that's shareable outside of the computer or outside of our heads. That could be a papier-mâché volcano or a poem or a theory or a musical composition or a robot or a guitar, but the making of something tangible is the best way to ensure that we learn something, by concretizing experiences. The essence of Piaget, Papert said, was how much learning occurs without being planned or organized by teachers or schools. His whole point was that children develop intellectually without being taught. Now, I mentioned the metaphor of mathland that drove Papert. As a mathematician, he saw the beauty and power of mathematics and knew that this was often the worst and least popular subject in school, and that we live in societies that revel in ignorance of mathematics. And he had a lot of profound and provocative thoughts on why this must be. One of them was that we need to create a mathland in which learning mathematics would come naturally. And the software and toys and teaching practices that he pioneered would allow even young learners to be mathematicians, to have mathematical experiences that wouldn't have been possible without digital technology. So here are a couple images created by a third grader the first time they were using a version of Logo, Seymour Papert's computer language for children. And they were able to create mathematical ideas kind of on the forefront of mathematical thinking, certainly at a grade level of complexity much higher than third grade. And this was the first thing these kids had ever done. I'm going to let Seymour talk about Mathland a moment for himself.
While it's true that most people in math class don't learn much math, most kids in French class don't learn much French. But we don't say that they're not Frenchly minded. We don't say they don't have a head for French, because we know that if they grew up in France, they'd learn French perfectly well. And I think that my image of learning mathematics is, if we all learned mathematics in Mathland, we would all learn mathematics perfectly well. And how can we create a Mathland? That's really what it's about.
So for more than 45 years, Papert was engaged in the creation of hardware and software that would allow children to immerse themselves in a mathland, where learning mathematics was as natural as learning French by living in France, as opposed to learning French by sitting in a class in Mumbai or Manhattan. Papert said that certain notions of mathematics are not sufficiently embedded in the culture for children to learn in their natural way, so they come to school to learn them. Once children are in school, we try to impose mathematics on them in much the same way it was imposed upon us, by writing on little scraps of paper. If before we ever allowed children to dance, we insisted that they spend hundreds of hours drawing dance steps on square pieces of paper, and only then, after they passed the test on our ability to draw dance steps, would we allow them to dance, they'd give up. They would think it was hopelessly complex and difficult. Those gifted in dance would also quit. And I think it is exactly what we do with mathematics. We teach to children in a way quite analogous to drawing dance steps on paper, and only those who can survive 12 years of that ever get to use it, to dance with it. So Seymour created one of the first programming languages for children called Logo, and it's been manifest in lots of versions, from Logo Writer to Apple Logo and Microworlds and Scratch and Star Logo, where kids are able to take formal mathematical language, communicate it to the computer, and get a result that allows them to mess about with the most powerful ideas in mathematics, to draw things, to control robots, to explore their environment. In the mid-1960s, he started talking about every child having a computer before most cities had a computer. In fact, when Alan Kay, a researcher at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, visited Seymour's lab in 1968, he was so impressed by the mathematics the kids were engaged in, the complexity of the mathematics that he saw young children engaged in using a mainframe computer, that on the flight home, he sketched that picture in the bottom right-hand corner of my slide of the Dynabook, which looks an awful lot like today's tablet computer. that from the very beginning, the notion of the computer was as a children's machine, some place where you can mess about with powerful ideas, this math land, and where you could share those ideas that you constructed. And all of the one-to-one computing efforts from Methodist Ladies College in Melbourne, Australia, where I helped lead professional development in 1990, through one laptop per child and ASB today, are rooted in Papert's idea of providing every child with a knowledge machine. In 1971, Papert and Cynthia Solomon said, "Only inertia and prejudice, not economics or lack of good educational ideas, stand in the way of providing every child with access to a computer. If every child were to be given access to a computer, computers would be cheap enough for every child to be given access to a computer." In 2004, Papert said, "The laptop is only an important device because it's disruptive." He invented robotics as a tool for learning, to concretize science and engineering, to make it possible for even young children in a playful fashion to have the experience of being mathematicians and scientists and engineers. He predicted the maker movement. In his paper, 20 Things to Do with a Computer, which I suggest you read because most of your schools can't live up to those goals today, even though it was written in 1971. He talks about computers being connected to motors, solenoids, relays, devices of various sorts that allow them to be able to invent and build an endless variety of systems. Since the late 1960s, Papert asked the fundamental question, is the computer program the child or the child program the computer? In an increasingly technologically complex world, this question is as important, if not more so today, than it was in 1968 when it was first posed. Now, there's a lot of talk about games in education. Papert was a pioneer in this as well. In 1990, Nintendo gave him $3 million, and he was always more about kids designing games than using software that would drill them in mathematics or grammar or try to trick them dishonestly into learning something that wasn't in their best interest. I have found that when they get the support and have access to suitable systems, children's enthusiasm for playing games easily gives rise to an enthusiasm for making them. And this in turn leads to more sophisticated thinking, where kids are learning mathematics and science and art and music composition and computer science in the context of making a game rather than just being a consumer of one. And when asked about the Nintendo grant in 1990, Papert told Newsweek, "I think the schools do more harm than Nintendo." Now, Seymour talked a lot about kid power, the idea that kids would be a force that would make the world a better place and would make schools more hospitable to the intentions of young people, that would make schools more constructive, more reflective of the culture in which the children live. And he rejected the idea that the computer itself was a Trojan horse. There's a lot of talk about the computer being a technological Trojan horse. Seymour reminds us that it wasn't the Trojan horse that was revolutionary. It was the army inside of it. And he said 100 years ago, John Dewey was saying things about educational change not very different from what I believe in. He couldn't get very far. And the reason why he couldn't get very far is that he had only philosophical arguments. He didn't have an army or the modern tools to construct knowledge in a variety of disciplines. You must have an army, and it's an army primarily of children and adults who are also concerned with change. Now, when we talk about contemporary education policy, as I mentioned earlier, Papert also predicted how the sort of immune system of schooling would reject the most powerful ideas, even if those were in the best interest of children and teachers. He said in 2000 that when ideas go to school, they lose their power. He often referred to mathematics education as something he loved and would say that you've killed something that I love. He was quite troubled by the state of computers in education and talked about how we suffer from verbal inflation, how we're so breathless about such meager improvements in practice, how so much investment in educational technology, both time and treasure, are dedicated to improving schools by 0.02%. Papert said there is no better reason than the intellectual timidity of the computers and education community, which seems remarkably reluctant to use computers for any purpose that fails to look like something that has been taught in schools for the past century. And he said that over 40 years ago. That indictment remains true today. In the same time period, he said, the phrase technology in education usually means inventing new gadgets to teach the same old stuff in a thinly disguised version of the same old way. Moreover, if the gadgets are computers, the same old teaching becomes incredibly more expensive and biased towards its dumbest parts, namely the kind of rote learning in which measurable results can be obtained by treating the children like pigeons in a Skinner box. Again from 1971. You want some evidence of this? The Los Angeles Unified School District is about to piss away between $1 billion and $2 billion on iPads. When they sent them home for with the first few kids, the kids realized they were broken because they didn't go on the internet. So the kids fixed them. The response to this, the district punished them, confiscated the computers, and now they've decided they're only going to use the $1 billion or $2 billion worth of iPads for standardized testing. Not to empower children, not to make a more creative, intellectually rich society, or to make schools more meaningful. When we look at ideas like the Common Core, it suffers from what Papert called instructionism. There's only two ways of viewing how education occurs. Either we believe that it's constructed by the learner in a social context through experience and access to expertise, or we believe that learning is the causal result of having been taught. And I heard Seymour say on a number of occasions, at best, school teaches 1/1000% of the world's knowledge. Yet we quibble endlessly over which 1/1000% is important. Learning to think was a lot more important to Papert than memorizing a bunch of stuff. And I just want to end on this quote, which I realize violates all the laws of PowerPoint, but it's quite profound. And it comes from an article that's based on a speech that Seymour gave in 1990 at the World Conference on Computers in Education, in which he raised a number of provocative issues, not the least of which being, why are we still having conferences on computers in education? We don't have conferences on pencils in education. And why is it that a school can get in a newspaper by announcing what color computer they bought? But Papert predicted in 1990 a lot of what's happening with the accountability and data fetishization that's destroying education, that's harming children, that's driving great teachers from the profession. He said, it is the freedom of the teacher to decide, and indeed the freedom of the children to decide, that is most horrifying to the bureaucrats who stand at the head of current education systems. This really doesn't work. Forcing everyone to teach by the rules does not improve the bad teachers, it only hobbles the good ones. And lastly, I think the greatest lesson that I learned from Seymour Papert in the 20-plus years I had the great privilege and honor and joy of working with him is that he dares all of us as educators, as parents, as citizens to do better on behalf of children. And if you'd like to learn more about Dr. Papert and his work, I curate a site called dailypapert.com. You can find collections of articles and speeches and videos and interviews there. Thank you for your time.